She was expelled from the settlement just before the harshest winter in 75 years. The widow was left alone with her child and 3 cows, and built a shelter that everyone laughed at. In winter, it became clear who was wrong. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The settlement had been built as if its founders had hoped the land would someday forgive them for staying. A handful of houses stood pressed against one another on the open plain, their wooden walls bleached by years of wind and sun, their roofs weighted with stones to keep them from lifting in storms. Beyond them stretched miles of grassland, broken only by a thin, dark line of forest to the north and a low rise of barren hills to the west. There was no fence marking where the settlement ended and the wilderness began. The land simply thinned out, structures giving way to emptiness, as though the place itself had decided where people were allowed to belong. Life here was ruled by winter. Everything else, faith, kindness, law, came second. People measured time not in years, but in seasons survived. A man was valued for the strength of his hands, a woman for her ability to endure, and a family for how little it burdened the rest when the snow came early or the cold stayed too long. Nothing was written down. There were no official titles, no deeds that truly held weight. What mattered was whether the community believed you would make it through the winter without dragging others down with you. Until recently, she had believed she belonged. Her husband had been a quiet man, not one of the loud voices at meetings, or the first to offer advice, but he worked harder than most. He rose before dawn, tended the animals, repaired fences that the wind tore apart each spring, and never complained when his back ached or his hands cracked and bled. Together they had built a life that was small but sufficient. 3 cows grazed on the common land near their cabin, providing milk, butter, and the promise of calves come spring. Their son had grown up believing that the world, though harsh, was stable, that his parents would always be there to hold it together. That illusion ended on a gray afternoon in late summer. The accident itself was simple, almost banal. A fallen beam, weakened by rot they had not noticed in time, gave way while her husband was repairing the shed. The sound of breaking wood was followed by a short, sharp cry that cut through the wind. By the time she reached him, his breathing was already shallow, his eyes unfocused. There was no doctor within days of travel, no medicine that could undo the damage. The men who came to help did what they could, lifting the beam, binding his wounds, whispering reassurances that sounded hollow, even as they were spoken. He died before nightfall. She did not scream. She did not faint. She sat beside him until his body grew still, and the wind outside the shed began to carry the first hints of autumn cold. Her son stood a few steps away, clutching the hem of her skirt, silent and pale, watching a truth settle into the world that neither of them was ready to understand. The burial took place the next morning. The ground was already hard beneath the thin layer of soil, as if the earth itself were preparing for winter. Neighbors came, heads bowed, hands awkwardly folded. Words of comfort were spoken, but they were careful words, measured, already retreating from intimacy. By the time the last shovel of dirt was thrown, something had shifted. She could feel it in the way people avoided her eyes, and how quickly they returned to their own chores once the ritual was complete. Grief, she learned, was permitted only briefly. After that, it became an inconvenience. In the days that followed, she noticed how conversations stopped when she approached. Men who had once nodded to her husband now spoke to her with polite distance, as though she were already halfway gone. Supplies were counted more carefully. Winter was coming, and winter demanded decisions. The decision came sooner than she expected. It was delivered without cruelty, but also without mercy. 2 of the older men came to her door one evening, their hats in their hands, their expressions sober. They spoke of the weather, of how the signs were troubling this year, of how the elders believed the coming winter would be worse than most. Then, gently, almost apologetically, they explained that the settlement could not afford to support those who might not make it on their own. She understood before they finished speaking. Her husband's name was not mentioned. It did not need to be. Without him, she was a woman alone with a child and 3 cows. A risk. They told her she would need to leave before the first heavy snow. That she should find somewhere else, perhaps closer to the forest, perhaps farther south. They framed it as concern, as a chance for her to survive somewhere better, suited to her circumstances. What they didn't say was that they had already decided she did not belong. Her son listened from the corner of the room, his brow furrowed in confusion. He did not understand why his home was suddenly something temporary, something that could be taken away with quiet words and lowered voices. That night, after the men left, she sat by the small table and stared at the flickering flame of the lamp. Anger did not come. Neither did pleading. Instead, there was a slow, sinking realization that no one was coming to save them. The settlement had not turned against her out of malice, but out of fear, and fear was stronger than memory. The days that followed passed in a haze of preparation. She packed what little they owned, choosing only what could be carried. The rest she left behind, knowing it would be claimed by someone else before winter deepened. The cows were her greatest concern. They were not just animals. They were the difference between life and starvation. She refused to leave them, even when some suggested she sell them and travel light. Without them, there would be no future anywhere. When the morning came to leave, the sky was low and heavy, the air sharp with the promise of frost. She hitched the cows and loaded the cart while her son watched the settlement for the last time. No one came to stop them. No one came to help. A few stood at a distance, pretending to be busy, unwilling to meet her gaze. As they moved away, the buildings shrank behind them, becoming smaller against the vastness of the land. The road was little more than a suggestion, a worn path through grass that bent under the wind. Ahead lay a stretch of ground no one wanted, land too exposed, too unforgiving. It was there she intended to stop. She did not know yet how she would survive the winter. She only knew that she could not turn back. The settlement had made its choice, and now she would have to make hers. The wind rose as they traveled, carrying with it the distant smell of cold. Her son walked beside the cart, silent, his small hand occasionally brushing against her arm, as if to reassure himself she was still there. She looked ahead, toward the open land and the dark line of trees beyond, and felt the weight of what lay before them settle into her bones. Winter was coming, and whatever happened next, it would happen beyond the reach of the settlement, on land, where survival would depend not on permission, but on understanding. The land where she finally stopped had no name, at least none that people still used. It lay beyond the informal boundary of the settlement, where the ground ceased to be convenient and became merely possible. The grass grew thinner here, flattened by constant wind, and the soil beneath showed through in pale, stubborn patches. To the north, the forest pressed closer, dark and dense, its edge uneven, as if the trees themselves hesitated to advance any farther into the open. To the west, the land sloped gently downward before rising again into low, barren hills that offered no shelter, only distance. No smoke rose here. No fences marked claims. The silence was different from the quiet of the settlement. It was deeper, heavier, carrying the sense that nothing would intervene if they failed. She unharnessed the cows and let them graze while she stood still, taking in the place that would now decide their fate. The wind tugged at her clothing, pulling cold fingers through the seams. Autumn had already begun to withdraw its warmth. Nights would soon turn hard, and mornings would greet them with frost that did not melt until midday. She felt the pressure of time immediately, like a weight placed across her shoulders. They spent the first night under a makeshift shelter of canvas stretched between the cart and a few leaning poles. It was barely enough to keep the dew off, and when the wind shifted in the night, the canvas snapped and strained, threatening to tear loose. Her son woke shivering, his breath visible even in the darkness. She pulled him closer, wrapping him in her own coat, and lay awake, listening to the sounds of the open land. Somewhere in the distance, an animal cried, and the cows shifted uneasily, their hooves scraping against the frozen ground. By morning, she understood with brutal clarity that this could not continue. She walked the area slowly, studying the way the wind moved across the land, how it struck the ground without obstruction, how it bent the grass in long, unbroken lines. There was no natural hollow, no rise large enough to serve as shelter. Anything they built would have to fight the elements head-on, and fighting the winter directly was a battle she knew she would lose. She thought of the houses in the settlement, their straight walls and sharp corners, how snow piled against them, and wind found every crack. Even those structures, built with many hands and years of effort, struggled when winter turned cruel. What chance did she have alone? Her son followed her silently as she moved, sensing the tension in her body. He asked no questions, but she could feel his eyes on her, waiting. She realized then that she was no longer deciding only for herself. Whatever choice she made would shape the way he understood the world, whether it was a place that abandoned you when you were weak, or one that demanded you learn its rules and adapt. The idea of building a proper house surfaced briefly, then vanished. A house required time, heavy timbers, precise joins. Even if she worked from dawn until darkness, she would not finish before the snow came. A simple shelter might keep the wind off, but it would not hold warmth. A separate barn for the cows was equally impossible. Without them, she and her son would not survive, but she could not afford to build twice. That was when the memory returned, unbidden, rising from a place she had not visited in years. It was not a clear recollection, not words spoken directly to her, but an image layered with the voice of her husband's father, long dead. She remembered sitting near the fire, listening to the old man talk about winters in another land, a place of mountains and endless cold. He had spoken of shelters built not from wood or stone, but from what the land provided in abundance. He had laughed when others dismissed the idea, saying only that people who survived long enough learned to stop arguing with the weather. At the time, she had not understood. It had sounded like a story meant to pass the evening, nothing more. Now, standing in the open wind with winter closing in, the image sharpened. A rounded shape, low and compact, walls thick not because they were strong, but because they held stillness. Air trapped and unmoving. Heat not generated by fire alone, but by bodies, by mass, by the refusal to let warmth escape. She knelt and pressed her hand into the ground, feeling the cold seeping upward. She did not know the science behind it. She had no words for insulation or thermal mass. But she understood something simpler, that the cold came from movement, from wind and exposure, and that if she could slow it, trap it, confuse it, she might have a chance. The cows, she realized, were not just mouths to feed. They were sources of warmth, living furnaces that produced heat simply by existing. If she could shelter them properly, that heat could be shared. The shape mattered. Straight walls gave the wind something to strike. Corners invited pressure, forced snow to gather and push. A round form offered no such invitation. The wind would have to move around it. The snow would slide instead of piling. She rose slowly, her mind turning with a clarity she had not felt since before her husband's death. The fear did not vanish, but it shifted, becoming something focused, something she could work with. She would build a single structure, not a house and not a barn, but something that served both purposes. A shelter where animals and people could survive together, sharing warmth, sharing breath. She would use what she had in abundance: hay from the last cutting, straw left unused in the fields, wood from the forest's edge. But the memory did not stop there. She looked again at the open land, at the way the wind had free passage from every direction. A structure made only of hay would not be enough. Hay could hold warmth, but it was vulnerable to constant assault. Snow driven hard enough would tear at it. Wind would strip it layer by layer. She needed a second defense. The image of old frontier buildings came to her then. The crude wooden overhangs built not for comfort, but for survival. Heavy beams set low, roofs angled to take the brunt of weather, sacrificing themselves so what lay beneath could endure. She imagined such a canopy standing over the rounded shelter, breaking the force of the wind before it reached the walls, catching the first blow of snow and ice. It would be brutal work. She knew that. Cutting timber, hauling it, setting it in place without help would test her limits. But without it, the shelter might not last the winter. That night, she told her son what she planned to do. She did not explain it as a gamble or a desperate hope. She spoke calmly, as though it were the most natural decision in the world. They would build something different, something meant to survive, not to please others. He listened carefully, his small hands wrapped around a cup of warm milk, and nodded as if he understood more than she expected. In the darkness, as the wind battered their thin canvas, she lay awake and thought through every step. Where the entrance should face, how wide it could be without letting the wind inside, how thick the walls needed to be, how much hay she could spare without starving the cows. She felt the weight of responsibility press down on her, heavier than grief, heavier than fear. There would be no second chances. If she was wrong, winter would not forgive her. By morning, the decision had settled into her bones. There was no turning back, no time left for doubt. The land did not care about her past or her loss. It cared only about what she would build upon it. As the first light crept over the hills, she rose, took the axe from the cart, and walked toward the forest's edge. The sound of steel biting into wood rang out across the empty land, sharp and decisive. She had chosen her path. Now she would have to see it through. The first days of work erased any lingering illusion that determination alone would be enough. The land did not soften because she had chosen it, and the season did not pause to give her time. Morning frost lingered longer now, whitening the ground until the sun climbed high enough to weaken it. And even then, the soil beneath remained stiff and unyielding. Each day began with cold, already settled into her hands, and each evening ended with exhaustion, heavy enough to make sleep immediate and dreamless. She began by choosing the exact spot, not by instinct alone, but by observation. She watched the way the wind moved across the open ground, how it struck the earth and flowed onward without pause. She walked the area again and again, standing still, feeling the pressure of air against her body, noting where it eased slightly, where the land offered even the smallest resistance. At last, she marked a place where the ground dipped just enough to break the wind's straight run, close enough to the forest to provide timber, but far enough to avoid falling branches and drifting snow from the trees themselves. The earth there was hard, but level. She cleared it by hand, scraping away grass and stones until a rough circle began to emerge. The shape felt strange at first, unfamiliar after a lifetime of straight walls and corners. But as she paced it out, step by step, the logic of it settled into her muscles. A circle had no weak points, no edge invited attack. Everything flowed back into itself. The hay came next. She hauled the bales one by one from the cart, each heavier than it had any right to be, their coarse fibers biting into her palms even through cloth. She learned quickly how to move them without wasting strength, how to rock them into position rather than lifting them outright. Her son helped as he could, dragging smaller bundles of straw, fetching rope, steadying bales as she set them down. He worked silently, his face serious, as though he understood that this was not play, but something that mattered in ways he could not yet name. The first ring of bales went down slowly, each one placed with care, pressed tightly against the next. She left a deliberate gap between this inner circle and where the outer wall would rise, though the space looked empty and wrong at first, as though she were making a mistake. She resisted the urge to fill it. Air, she reminded herself, was part of the structure, even if it could not be seen. As the walls grew, the labor deepened. She worked from dawn until the light failed, stopping only to tend the cows and prepare simple meals. Her shoulders burned constantly, and her hands cracked, despite the oil she rubbed into them at night. More than once she wondered whether her body would give out before the shelter took shape. But each time doubt surfaced, she forced herself to look at what had already been built. The circle stood firm, unremarkable yet solid. Its weight settled evenly into the ground. Her son began to ask questions then. Why the walls curved instead of rising straight. Why the entrance was narrow and angled away from the wind. She answered as best she could, sometimes with explanation, sometimes simply by showing him. She made him stand inside the half-built structure on windy afternoons, had him feel how the air moved differently there, softer, less biting. His eyes widened with understanding that did not require words. By the end of the first week, the walls had risen to her waist. The structure already felt different from anything she had known. When the wind blew hard across the plain, it slid around the curved surface instead of striking it head-on. Snow flurries dusted the ground one morning and then vanished by noon, leaving the hay dry beneath the weak sun. It was then that the first of the settlers rode past. He did not stop at first, only slowed his horse long enough to stare. His gaze traveled from the uneven ring of hay to the woman working alone, then to the child steadying a bale that looked far too heavy for him. The man shook his head and laughed softly, the sound carried away by the wind, and rode on without a word. More followed in the days after. Some laughed openly, others said nothing, but their looks spoke clearly enough. She heard the words they used when they thought she could not. Foolish, desperate, already lost. She did not answer them. Every moment spent speaking would be a moment stolen from the work, and she could afford none. As the walls climbed higher, she began the inward curve, tilting each bale slightly so that the structure leaned back toward its center. It was awkward at first, the balance unfamiliar, but gradually the form took on a sense of inevitability, as though it were guiding her hands rather than the other way around. The dome began to emerge, organic and unplanned in appearance, yet deliberate in every placement. At night, she lay awake, running her hands over the day's aches, listening to the wind test the unfinished walls. Each creak and shift sent a jolt of fear through her, but the structure held. By morning, she returned to it with renewed urgency, reinforcing weak spots, tightening gaps, pressing the bales together until the walls felt dense and unyielding. The wooden canopy loomed over her thoughts constantly, a promise and a threat both. The hay dome alone felt strong, but she knew it would not be enough. The timber had to be cut, hauled, and set while there was still time, while the ground had not yet frozen beyond all hope. She went into the forest with the axe at dawn, leaving her son to tend the cows under her instructions. The trees stood close together, their branches already thinning as autumn stripped them bare. She chose carefully, selecting those straight enough to bear weight, old enough to be strong, but not so massive that she could not manage them alone. Each tree fell with a crack that echoed through the woods, the sound sharp and final. She worked methodically, pausing often to catch her breath, forcing herself to stop before exhaustion led to injury. Dragging the logs back was the hardest work of all. She used rope and leverage, inching them forward across the ground, her muscles screaming in protest. More than once she collapsed beside them, her breath ragged, her vision swimming. Each time she lay still until the shaking passed, then rose again, refusing to consider what would happen if she did not. Her son watched her return each evening with a mixture of fear and awe. He had never seen her like this, pushed so far beyond the boundaries of ordinary labor. He began to mimic her seriousness, taking on small tasks without being asked, stacking kindling, spreading straw, checking the cow's hooves for stones. Setting the canopy posts required a precision she could not afford to get wrong. She dug holes by hand, her fingers numb and bleeding, measured the distances again and again, then levered the posts upright, using rope and the weight of the earth itself. When they stood at last, rough and uneven but firm, she felt something loosen in her chest for the first time in weeks. The beams went up next, lashed and wedged into place, forming a crude roof that hovered over the hay dome without touching it. The gap between them was intentional. The wood would take the punishment of wind and snow, while the hay beneath remained sheltered, breathing, intact. She covered the canopy with boards and salvaged planks, weighted them with stones where she could, knowing that perfection was not required, only endurance. The first real snow came 2 days later. It fell heavily, silently, blanketing the ground and clinging to every surface. She stood beneath the canopy and watched as flakes struck the wooden roof and slid away, leaving the hay dome beneath untouched. The sight brought a sharp sting to her eyes that surprised her with its intensity. She had not allowed herself hope until that moment. She worked through the snowfall, finishing the entrance, narrowing it, angling it away from the prevailing wind. She spread thick bedding inside, layer upon layer, until the ground beneath disappeared. When at last she led the cows inside, they hesitated only briefly before settling, their bodies filling the space with warmth and sound. That night, she and her son slept inside for the first time. The wind roared outside, but inside the dome it was muted, reduced to a distant presence. The air felt different, heavier, calmer. Her son slept deeply, his breathing slow and even, his body pressed against hers. She lay awake longer, listening to the animals shift and breathe, feeling the faint warmth begin to build around them. The shelter was finished, but winter had only begun. As she closed her eyes at last, she knew that the true test was still ahead. Winter did not arrive all at once. It crept in with patience, as though it wished to be certain that nothing unprepared would escape it. The first days after the shelter was finished were deceptively calm. Snow fell lightly, then stopped. The wind softened, then returned in short, testing gusts, circling the structure as if learning its shape. Each morning brought colder ground. Each night pressed deeper chill into the air. The land changed color, losing what little warmth it had left until everything lay under a muted palette of white, gray, and dull brown. Inside the dome, life settled into a rhythm that felt almost unreal in its steadiness. The cows adjusted quickly, arranging themselves along the curved walls as though guided by an instinct older than fences and barns. Their bodies radiated warmth, slow and constant, filling the space with a living presence. The air remained dry. Their breath rose and vanished instead of clinging and freezing. The hay walls seemed to absorb sound as well as cold, turning the roar of the wind outside into a distant, hollow murmur. Her son noticed the difference first. On the third night, he woke and whispered that his feet were warm. He sounded surprised, as if warmth itself had become something unexpected. She held him closer, feeling the truth of his words settle into her own bones. The shelter was working. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but well enough. Well enough to live. As the days shortened, the cold sharpened. Frost formed on the outside of the canopy beams, thickening into white crusts that did not melt even at midday. Snow began to accumulate in earnest, driven sideways by wind that howled across the open land with nothing to slow it. The dome disappeared and reappeared beneath drifting layers, its rounded form shedding snow in slow slides that piled harmlessly at its base. The wooden canopy bore the brunt of the assault, creaking and groaning under weight that would have crushed a lesser structure, but it held. Inside, the temperature changed little. The difference between night and day was muted, smoothed by the mass of hay and the steady presence of the animals. She learned to read the shelter as she once read the weather, sensing subtle shifts in air and sound. When the cows were restless, she knew a storm was coming. When the air grew still and heavy, she knew the cold would deepen. Food became the measure of time. She rationed carefully, counting each bundle of hay, each scoop of grain. The cows ate more now, their bodies demanding fuel to maintain warmth, but not as much as she had feared. Sheltered from the wind, they did not burn themselves hollow fighting the cold. Milk continued to come, thin but steady, enough to keep her son fed and strong. She watched his cheeks, his eyes, looking for signs of weakness, and found none. Beyond the shelter, the world began to break. The settlement, once a collection of solid shapes against the horizon, faded into rumor and memory. Smoke no longer rose regularly. On clear days, she could sometimes see movement in the distance, figures battling drifts or hauling something heavy and lifeless behind them. On stormy days, nothing was visible at all, the land reduced to a shifting wall of white. She heard stories only when the wind carried distant voices or when someone passed near enough to shout over the storm. Cattle lost to cold, roofs collapsed under snow, supplies dwindling faster than expected, people burning wood meant for spring repairs just to keep their houses from freezing solid. Each fragment of information reinforced what she already knew. Winter was winning. The storm that truly tested the shelter arrived without warning. One evening, the air grew strangely warm, the sky lowering until it pressed close to the land. By morning, the wind was screaming. Snow fell so thickly that distance vanished, the world reduced to a few feet of visibility. The cows shifted nervously, stamping and snorting, their unease contagious. She moved among them, speaking softly, her voice steady even as her heart pounded. The wind found every weakness in the land, but not in the dome. It slid over the curved walls, struck the canopy, and broke apart. Its force scattered and dulled. Snow piled against one side, rising higher and higher until the dome was half buried. She worried then, fearing collapse, but the weight settled evenly, pressing inward instead of downward, sealing the shelter more tightly than before. The cold that followed was merciless. Nights plunged far below anything she had known. The air outside grew so sharp it felt solid, as though it might shatter if struck. Inside, the cold crept closer, but slowly, resisted at every step. She measured it not with instruments, but with her own body, with the way her breath no longer fogged as thickly, with the way her son slept through the night without shivering. They did not go outside for days at a time, the entrance filled with packed snow, forcing her to dig a narrow tunnel each time she needed to check the animals or clear the opening. The work was dangerous. The wind could knock a person down, steal breath from lungs, turn a simple task into a fatal mistake. She timed each excursion carefully, working in short bursts, returning inside before exhaustion could take hold. It was during one of these storms that someone came. She heard him before she saw him, a faint, desperate sound carried on the wind. At first she thought it was an animal, but then a voice broke through, raw and strained, calling out words she could barely make out. She hesitated only a moment before pulling on her coat and forcing her way through the tunnel. The man was barely standing, his face white with frost, his eyes wild. He leaned heavily on a broken fence post, using it as a staff to keep himself upright. When he saw her, his relief was so sudden it looked like pain. He stared past her, toward the shelter, as though he could not quite believe it was real. He spoke little. He did not need to. His presence alone told the story. Loss. Failure. The settlement had underestimated the winter, and it had taken its payment in flesh and bone. She led him inside without ceremony. The warmth hit him like a blow. He sagged against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands shaking violently. She gave him water, then warm milk, watching as color slowly returned to his face. He stared around him, at the cows standing calmly, at the dry walls, at the child sitting close to the animals, with a blanket around his shoulders. He said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice broke. He had come expecting to find a grave. Instead, he had found life. She did not ask questions. She did not offer explanations. There was no need. The shelter spoke for itself. When he left, he did so with a look she recognized, one she had seen on her own face weeks earlier. The look of someone who has been forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew. Winter dragged on. Days blurred together, marked only by storms and brief, brittle clearings when the sun rose cold and distant, offering light without warmth. She kept careful track of time, counting weeks by the dwindling haystacks and the gradual lengthening of daylight. The cows endured. Her son endured. She endured. When the worst of the cold finally broke, it did so quietly. One morning she woke to silence, not the muffled quiet of snow, but a deeper stillness, as though the land itself were holding its breath. She stepped outside and saw the sky clear and vast, an impossible blue stretching from horizon to horizon. The temperature was still cruel, but the wind had fallen away. Spring did not arrive then, not truly, but something had shifted. The sun lingered longer each day. Snow began to crust and settle instead of growing deeper. She dug out the entrance fully, standing back to look at the structure for the first time in weeks. The dome was scarred and weathered, half buried, but intact. The canopy stood firm, its beams bowed but unbroken. News came slowly after that, carried by survivors. The settlement counted its losses. Animals gone, stores depleted, families broken or scattered. When word reached them that her cows were alive, that she and her child had survived, disbelief spread quickly, followed by something like shame. When the men finally came to her, they did not bring demands. They brought offers. A place back among them. Help rebuilding. An acknowledgement, awkward and incomplete, that they had been wrong. She listened. She said little. Winter had taught her something she could not forget. She had survived not because she belonged to the settlement, but because she had learned to listen to the land itself. She had built something that answered winter on its own terms, and in doing so, she had changed. When she looked at her son, taller now, stronger, his eyes steady, she knew the choice was no longer simple. The land where they stood had tested them and found them worthy. Whether she returned or stayed, she would never again measure her worth by the judgment of others. As the snow slowly began its retreat and the first dark patches of earth reappeared, she stood beside the dome and rested her hand against its rough surface. It was not beautiful. It was not meant to be. It had done what it was built to do. It had kept them alive. And in the quiet after winter's fury, that was enough. If this story stayed with you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel to watch the next chapters and discover more frontier stories about survival, forgotten knowledge, and the strength it takes to endure when the world turns away. Share this video with someone who values stories like these and help keep them alive.